He was tracking a wild animal, but instead of prey, he saw something beyond explanation, a massive cruise ship hanging off the edge of a cliff. But what he found inside shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The morning light crept over the jagged coastline, weak and colorless after 3 days of unrelenting rain. The ocean was still restless, its surface folding in long gray ridges that smashed against the rocks below with hollow, rhythmic violence. The storm had clawed away half the cliffside, dragging trees and soil into the sea, leaving the land bruised and broken. The air smelled of salt, rust, and the faint sweetness of decaying vegetation. Seabirds wheeled high above, but made no sound, as if even they were still wary of the silence that followed the tempest. Miles Harper moved slowly along the soaked trail with his old dog, Bo, padding close at his heels. He had lived on this coast for almost a decade, long enough to know how it changed after a storm. The forest seemed to breathe differently, the earth heavier underfoot, every branch dripping. He carried a battered rifle slung over one shoulder and a canvas pack across his back. Inside it, a coil of rope, a folding knife, and the same dented thermos he had used since his years at sea. His face was rough and wind-burned, his eyes dark and observant. Once he had been a merchant sailor, but those days were gone. Now he hunted small game, trapped, fished, and repaired nets for nearby villages when he needed money. The wind was gentle, yet every gust carried the taste of metal. Miles noticed it before Bo did, a faint hum beneath the crash of the waves. It wasn't the groan of a tree or the creak of stone, but something deeper, hollow and mechanical, like a great body shifting under strain. Bo stopped, ears pricked, tail stiff. The dog sniffed the air and looked toward the edge of the cliff. Miles followed, boots slipping on the slick earth, and then the fog ahead parted for a breath. At first he thought he was seeing the skeleton of a building, some industrial ruin torn from its foundations. But as the mist drew back further, his eyes widened. There, stretched across the shattered cliffs, was the impossible. A massive ship, no, an ocean liner, lodged between two rock formations, its bow thrust over open air, its stern buried in the torn earth. The hull was streaked with rust, the paint flaked into dull gray patches, and gulls circled above its decks. The scale of it dwarfed everything around, a mountain of corroded steel balanced on the edge of oblivion. Miles stood without moving for several minutes. The only sound was the wind whistling through broken railings and the groan of the metal carcass as the tide shifted below. He counted lifeboat racks, empty, windows shattered, portions of the upper deck sagged like the ribs of a dying beast. There was no human movement, no lights, nothing to suggest anyone had been here for years. He approached slowly, the mud sucking at his boots, Bo trodden ahead with short, cautious steps. At the base of the cliff, he found what might once have been a service ramp or a loading path, now half collapsed. A thick cable trailed from the rocks to the ship's underside, snapped clean. It looked as though someone had tried to anchor the vessel or drag it inland, but the effort had failed. Miles crouched, touching the frayed end of the cable. It was corroded, but not ancient. The salt hadn't had time to devour it completely. Maybe a year, 2 at most. He raised his eyes again to the monstrous silhouette above. It was hard to imagine how something so large could have ended up here. The coastline was wild, but there were no shipping lanes nearby, no ports within 100 kilometers. The idea of a storm driving a vessel of that size so far inland seemed absurd. Still, he knew the sea's cruelty. He had seen steel bend and engines die under the weight of waves. Perhaps it wasn't impossible, just grotesquely improbable. Bo barked once, sharply, drawing his attention to a point where a broken gangway clung to the rock. The lower end dangled above a slope of mud and debris. Miles followed the dog's gaze, narrowing his eyes. There was a way up, though it was steep and treacherous. The fog was beginning to lift now, revealing more of the ship's underside. A labyrinth of rusted beams and torn plates, jagged edges glinting faintly in the weak sunlight. He hesitated, the old sailor in him whispering caution. Ships were coffins when they died. The air inside them turned foul, the floors unstable. One wrong step, and the whole carcass could crumble. But the other voice, the one that had carried him through storms and across oceans, urged him forward. He slung his rifle over his back, tightened the strap of his pack, and began climbing. The ascent was brutal. The ground was soft, sliding under his boots, and the closer he got to the hull, the stronger the metallic odor became. He felt the scale of the thing now, immense and oppressive, like standing beneath a skyscraper tilted on its side. Bo followed, panting but determined. When they reached the base of the gangway, Miles paused to rest. The metal steps above were slick with algae, the railings twisted, but they seemed solid enough. He tested the first step. It creaked but held. Step by step he ascended, his breath visible in the damp air. The higher he climbed, the more the sea roared below, invisible under the cliff's lip. He could feel the faint vibration of waves striking the rocks far beneath him. When he finally reached the ship's hull, he found a jagged tear where the gangway had once been welded. Through it, darkness yawned. The dog whimpered. Miles patted its head. "Easy," he murmured, though his own heart was thudding. He ducked inside. The interior swallowed the light. His flashlight beam sliced through a haze of dust and salt crystals. The corridor stretched away in both directions, lined with peeling wallpaper and brass fixtures turned green with corrosion. The air was heavy and unmoving, carrying the faint sweetness of mold. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots echoing. The ship creaked around him, the faint rhythmic groan of steel under strain. Somewhere, deep inside, water dripped steadily, like a clock marking forgotten time. He passed what had once been a reception area, a desk overturned, brochures scattered on the floor, their ink washed away. The walls bore the name Aurora Line in faded lettering, the company logo still visible beneath streaks of rust. A cruise liner, then. He remembered hearing of one that vanished 3 years ago in the Atlantic, though the name escaped him. Some said it had gone down in a hurricane. Others believed it was hijacked. He had dismissed the stories back then, thinking them just another ghost tale from the sea. But now, standing in the hollow corridors of this carcass, the thought returned with unsettling weight. Bo sniffed at a pile of torn upholstery. Miles moved deeper. Every corner revealed another fragment of still life. A dining hall with tables set and glassware intact, a piano overturned, a child's doll half buried under debris. It was as though the people had simply vanished mid-motion. He tried not to imagine what had happened here. He reached the stairwell and looked up. The upper decks were open to the light, shafts of gray cutting through holes in the ceiling. Dust shimmered in the beams. He climbed carefully, hand sliding along the damp rail. His steps echoed like footsteps in a cathedral. On the promenade deck, the view took his breath. From here, the sea stretched endlessly below, the cliff face disappearing into the fog. The ship's bow extended far beyond the edge, hovering over the abyss. He felt dizzy just looking at it. He walked toward the bridge, noticing details now, the pattern of salt trails along the walls, the dried seaweed tangled in corners, a single seagull's feather caught in a crack. The bridge doors were ajar. Inside, the control panels were covered in dust but otherwise intact. The wheel was still fixed in its housing, the compass shattered, the navigation screens dark. On the desk lay a chart folded open, routes traced in red pencil. One line led straight into a blank expanse of ocean, then ended abruptly, as if the hand that drew it had stopped mid-stroke. He brushed the chart with his fingers. The paper disintegrated slightly, brittle from salt. He could almost see the crew here, the captain gripping the rail as the storm closed in, the officers shouting coordinates, the passengers below screaming. The image was vivid, almost unbearable. The dog growled suddenly, low and uneasy. Miles looked around. The ship moaned, a deep, drawn-out sound as the wind swept through the corridors. The whole structure shifted slightly under his feet. For a moment, he imagined the bow slipping, the entire vessel sliding free and plunging into the sea. His muscles tensed, ready to leap back toward the gangway. But then the motion stopped. Silence returned. He exhaled slowly. His instincts told him to leave, to mark the coordinates, report the wreck to the authorities, and never set foot here again. But something deeper pushed him on. The questions were too many. Why had the ship ended up here? Why had no one come for it? And if this truly... He looked once more through the broken windows at the horizon. The sea had quieted, a sheet of dull steel under the evening light. Somewhere, far below, waves crashed against rock, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat. He turned from the bridge and started back down the corridor, flashlight trembling in his hand. He needed to see the lower decks, the engine rooms, the truth buried beneath. The sun was sinking by the time he reached the stairwell again. The dog hesitated, whining softly. Miles knelt and scratched its neck. "Just a look," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was convincing. He took a breath, feeling the chill of the ship seep into his bones, and began descending into the darkness. The light faded behind him, swallowed by the steel walls. Ahead, the air grew thick, damp, and warmer, carrying the sour tang of oil. He could hear the slow drip of water echoing from somewhere far below. Bo stayed close, tail tucked, ears flat. Miles stopped at the next landing and looked up. Through a hole in the ceiling, he could see a sliver of gray sky. The storm clouds were returning. The first raindrops began to patter against the deck plates, soft and irregular. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and continued down, one step at a time, into the belly of the ship. He didn't yet know what waited in the dark, the signs of panic, the traces of flight, the unanswered horror of human greed, but he felt its weight pressing through the silence, patient and unyielding. Somewhere below, among the tangled corridors and rusted machines, the truth was waiting to be found. And so, with the sea roaring far beneath the cliffs and the dying light fading behind him, Miles Harper and his dog vanished into the hollow depths of the lost ship, where the air was thick with secrets and the echoes of the storm still lingered like breath. The stairwell seemed endless as Miles descended, his flashlight trembling over rusted railings and flaking paint. The air thickened with each step, turning damp and metallic. Water dripped rhythmically from somewhere deep below, each drop echoing through the hollow steel like a ticking clock. Bo padded behind him, her claws clicking softly on the steps, her breathing shallow and uneasy. The ship had swallowed them whole, sealing out the faint light of the storm-gray sky above. Here, Everything smelled of oil, salt, and slow decay. At the bottom of the stairs, the corridor stretched in both directions, a tunnel of corrosion and shadow. Miles swept the light across the walls, finding door after door, each marked with faded lettering, names of rooms that once hummed with life. Laundry, engine crew quarters, infirmary. Now they stood silent. He stepped inside the first door. The floor was littered with broken tiles, and a thin layer of brine pooled around his boots. In the corner stood a row of rusted lockers, their doors slightly ajar. Inside, he saw uniforms, navy blue, the fabric stiff with salt. Some still had name patches sewn over the breast pockets, letters barely legible. The air was stale, untouched for years, yet it didn't feel abandoned long enough to be history. There was still a trace of presence, a residue of something that hadn't entirely left. He moved on, deeper into the corridor. The light picked out the remains of a wall clock, its hands frozen just after midnight. Perhaps the power had gone out at that moment, freezing the ship in time. Miles thought about storms, how quickly order turned to chaos when the sea rose against you. He had lived through enough to know that when things began to fail, they failed all at once. Engines stopped, lights flickered out, radios went silent. Panic grew like mold. The silence in this place felt heavier than panic, though. It was deliberate, suffocating. Something about it felt wrong. He turned a corner and entered a wider passage that led upward. Here, the walls were cleaner, the flooring still intact. A brass handrail gleamed faintly under his light, tarnished but sturdy. At the end of the corridor stood a door with a frosted glass window. He wiped the dust from it with his sleeve and read the etched letters. Main Dining Hall. He pushed it open, the hinges screeching in protest. The beam of his flashlight swept across a vast room. Rows of tables still stood in place, draped with yellowed tablecloths. Glasses and plates were arranged as though for a dinner that never came. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals dulled by salt, swaying gently with the movement of the ship. The sight froze him. It wasn't just that the room was intact. It was preserved, almost reverent, like a mausoleum built for the living. Dust rose around him in the beam of light. A child's chair lay toppled beside one of the tables, its small cushion torn. A deck of cards was scattered across another, the faces stuck together with dampness. He picked one up, an ace of hearts, and turned it in the light. The paper disintegrated between his fingers. On the far wall, a painting hung crookedly. Its colors bled into brown and gray. The plaque beneath read, Aurora Line, 2016, maiden voyage. The words struck him. If this was truly that ship, then he was standing inside a tomb of almost 300 people who had vanished without trace. Bo sniffed the air and whimpered. Miles followed the dog's gaze to the far end of the hall, where double doors stood slightly open. Beyond them was darkness, a hallway leading to the upper decks. He hesitated, listening. For a moment, he thought he heard something. A faint metallic knock, distant, irregular. It might have been the hull settling or the wind shifting through cracks, but it made his skin tighten. He turned off his flashlight, letting his eyes adjust. The faint gray of daylight filtered through shattered windows, casting pale stripes across the tables. Nothing moved. The silence returned, complete and absolute. He clicked the light back on and continued toward the bridge. The corridors narrowed as he climbed. Along the way he passed cabins with half-open doors, each revealing fragments of interrupted lives. A pair of sunglasses on a counter, a book lying open beside an unmade bed, a child's drawing taped to a wall. One room still smelled faintly of perfume, a ghost of some woman who had stood here brushing her hair before the storm. The mundanity of it all was worse than any nightmare. Nothing here screamed disaster. It whispered it, quietly, through what was left behind. When he reached the bridge deck, the air felt colder. The wind slid through broken windows, carrying the distant hiss of waves. He entered through the captain's door, the metal handle slick with condensation. Inside, the bridge was a ruin of dust and forgotten authority. The control panels were covered with a fine white crust of salt. The wheel remained locked in place, frozen mid-turn. A row of black screens lined the wall, their surfaces cracked and opaque. A coffee mug lay on the floor, its porcelain split cleanly in half. On the navigation desk lay an open logbook. Miles lifted it carefully, brushing away a thin layer of grime. The pages were warped, the ink smeared, but some lines were legible. 347. Course deviation approved. Satellite link severed. Proceed on alternative route. Awaiting further instruction. The handwriting was shaky, rushed. Another entry below it read simply, "Engines unstable, crew divided, no response from HQ." Then the ink trailed off mid-line. The rest of the page was blank. He set the book down and looked around. The bridge windows framed the open ocean on one side and the ragged cliff on the other. The ship's bow projected far out over the void, as though trying to escape the land itself. From up here, he could see the waves breaking far below, their spray carried upward by the wind. It made him dizzy. The realization of where he stood, the sheer impossibility of this wreck balanced between worlds, hit him again with full force. Bo barked suddenly, short and sharp. Miles turned. The dog was standing near the corner console, sniffing at something on the floor. He crouched beside her and saw a torn piece of fabric caught under a chair leg. He pulled it free and held it to the light. It was part of a life jacket, the letters still visible across it, Aurora Line. He remembered the reports now, faint headlines from years ago: cruise ship Aurora Line lost at sea, search suspended after 10 days. No wreckage, no survivors, no signal. And yet, here it was, hundreds of miles from any recorded search zone, perched on the edge of a continent. He tried to imagine the sequence of events. The ship adrift in a storm, communications cut, the crew divided. Some decision made in panic, a turn toward the west, maybe toward the coast. But how could it have ended like this, impaled upon the earth itself? Even if the storm had driven it toward land, no natural force could have carried it this far up. It was as if the sea had spat it out. Miles moved to the control panel again, searching for signs of how long the ship had been lifeless. The gauges were frozen, the needles locked in random positions. The radio equipment was gone, stripped out or taken. On the floor beside the chart table lay a tangle of wires leading to a small power junction. He traced them with his fingers and realized the ship's emergency circuits might still hold residual charge from the backup generators. If someone had powered, he looked at Bo. The dog's ears were flattened, her eyes wide and alert. Miles felt it too, the instinctive recognition of another presence, faint but real. He turned off his flashlight again and listened. The ship groaned underfoot, a deep sigh from its metal bones. Then, faintly, from somewhere below, came another sound. A single creak, then a soft clatter, like something being moved. He stood motionless, waiting. counting the seconds. Nothing followed. Perhaps it was the wind or the hull settling. Perhaps. But he had spent too many years at sea to mistake the rhythm of movement. This was different. Brief, purposeful. He switched the light back on and scanned the floor once more. Beside the captain's chair, a small compartment had been pried open. Inside were papers, maps, and a photograph sealed in plastic. He pulled it out. The picture showed the ship in its prime, decks filled with smiling passengers. At the bottom, handwritten in marker, were the words, "To those who believed this was paradise." He slipped the photo into his pocket and closed the compartment. The daylight was fading now, dimming to the cold blue of approaching evening. The air outside was thickening with mist again, the horizon disappearing into gray. He knew he couldn't stay long, not with night coming and the weather turning. Still, a strange pull kept him there, urging him to explore one more deck, one more corridor. He needed to understand why this place existed in silence. Bo whined softly as he stepped back toward the stairwell. Miles paused at the threshold and looked back once more. The bridge seemed almost peaceful now, the light faintly golden from the dying sun. Dust floated like ash in the air. He could almost hear the echo of voices that once filled this space. Orders shouted, laughter, the low hum of engines. Then the vision passed, leaving only the creaking of the ship and the slow, steady breath of the sea below. He made his way down, moving toward the lower decks again, where the smell of oil grew stronger. Somewhere beneath these floors lay the engines, the generators, and perhaps answers. He wanted to find the ship's heart, the place where everything had gone wrong. The flashlight flickered as he walked, casting wavering shadows on the walls. He passed another cabin, its door half torn from the hinges. Inside, he glimpsed a suitcase lying open on the bed, clothes still folded inside. A pair of sunglasses rested on the pillow, their lenses cracked. He picked them up, then set them back down. Whoever owned them had intended to return. The stairwell twisted again, leading downward. The deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of the ship above him. Every creak was magnified, every echo louder. Bo stayed close now, brushing against his leg. They moved together through a narrow passage until a faint draft touched his face. It carried the smell of seawater and fuel. He followed it to a large doorway, its sign rusted and barely readable. Engine access. The door was wedged open by a fallen beam. Miles crouched and squeezed through, the beam scraping against his pack. Inside, the air was thicker, warmer, vibrating faintly with the sea's movement against the hull. The room was enormous, its walls vanishing into darkness. His light revealed the vast shapes of machinery, turbines, generators, pipes coiled like intestines. Some of them were broken open, others coated in a layer of oily residue. He stepped carefully along the metal walkway, shining the light down between the gaps. Pools of black water glistened below. Something metallic bobbed gently in it, clinking against the railing. He realized suddenly that his flashlight beam had caught on something bright in the distance. A door, smaller than the others, reinforced, with a heavy wheel handle. The words on it were still legible. Medical storage. The letters were crisp, not eroded. This door had been sealed more recently than the rest. He approached, heart pounding. The wheel resisted, but turned with a groan. The seal broke, releasing a wave of air that smelled faintly of alcohol and chemicals. He stepped inside. The room was lined with metal shelves, most still intact. Boxes lay scattered across the floor, marked with red hazard symbols and printed labels. antibiotics, protective gear, surgical instruments. On a counter near the wall sat several sealed canisters, the kind used for transporting biological material. One of them was open and empty. Miles felt the chill crawl up his spine. This was no passenger storage. This was a laboratory. The hum of refrigeration units still echoed faintly in the corners, though no power ran through the ship. Someone had been here. Papers were strewn across a desk, medical reports typed in English and French. He picked one up and read the heading, Helios Maritime Foundation, Project Vantage, Subject Transfer Log. His pulse quickened as he skimmed the lines. The reports mentioned volunteers, control groups, and containment failures. None of it belonged on a cruise liner. A sound interrupted him, a faint metallic clang, like something dropped in the corridor outside. Bo growled. Miles turned off the light instantly, plunging them into blackness. He held his breath, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer, slow and deliberate. Someone, or something, was moving through the passage beyond the door. He waited until the noise faded, then turned the flashlight back on, sweeping it across the room. Nothing. The door remained open, the corridor beyond empty. He looked once more at the documents in his hand, then folded them carefully and tucked them into his jacket. Whatever this ship had been, it was not an accident. It was a secret, buried under the guise of disaster. He backed towards the door, keeping the light low. The engines groaned faintly beneath the floor, though they had been dead for years. Perhaps it was the tide. Or perhaps something heavier, settling under the ship's immense weight. He didn't care to find out. When he reached the corridor again, the air felt colder. The storm outside was returning, and the light through the upper stairwell had dimmed to a deep slate gray. Miles looked once more at the darkness stretching ahead of him and felt, for the first time, the true loneliness of this place. Whatever happened on this ship had left a wound in the world, and he had stepped right into it. He turned toward the stairs, Bo close at his heel, the documents pressed against his chest. He would return tomorrow, he told himself, in daylight, with proper tools, with calm. But even as he thought it, he knew he wouldn't sleep that night. Not after seeing what lay inside this hollow monument of steel. Outside, thunder rolled again, shaking the hall. The wind howled through the open windows above, carrying the first drops of rain. As Miles climbed towards the faint promise of light, he could feel the ship tremble beneath him, groaning like a creature reluctant to wake. It seemed to breathe with the sea itself, its hollow decks whispering secrets through every gust of wind. He didn't look back. If he did, he feared he might see something standing there in the dark, a shadow that was not his own. By the time he reached the upper corridor again, the world outside had faded into a storm-torn dusk. The waves were striking the cliff harder now, their rhythm echoing through the metal underfoot. He moved quickly to the gap in the hull where he had entered, climbed through, and stood once more in the open air. The sky was bruised purple, rain sweeping sideways across the horizon. Behind him, the massive ship loomed in the mist, silent and watchful, its bow jutting into the void. Miles adjusted his pack, wiped the rain from his face, and began the climb down toward the shore. The wind howled around him, pulling at his coat. Bo followed, slipping once but recovering, her eyes bright against the dark. When they reached the ground, Miles turned for one last look. The liner stood like a monument to human arrogance, an impossible relic lodged between sea and sky, waiting for someone to remember it. Lightning flashed behind it, illuminating its broken decks. For an instant, it looked alive again, its windows glinting like eyes. Then the light vanished, and the ship returned to shadow. Miles walked into the rain, the documents pressing cold against his chest, and the realization settling deep in his mind. Whatever had happened on that ship, it was not finished. The silence he'd left behind felt too deliberate, too heavy. It was not the emptiness of abandonment, but the hush of something hidden. And though he didn't yet know it, what he had just seen was only the beginning of the truth waiting in the depths of the Aurora line. Rain beat down in heavy, uneven sheets as Miles returned the next morning, the memory of the ship's hollow silence still lingering in his mind. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving the world washed clean but strangely lifeless. The cliffs were slick and treacherous, the air thick with mist that clung to his skin. Bo ran ahead, her paws sinking into the wet ground, tail low but wagging cautiously. The previous night's unease had not left her either. She sniffed the air constantly, alert to every sound. Miles carried a heavier pack this time: tools, a lantern, batteries, and a small camera he had salvaged years ago from a fishing vessel. He needed proof of what he had seen, not only for himself, but because some part of him already knew that what he was walking toward was more than a shipwreck. It was a secret. The mud pulled at his boots, and the air smelled of rust and ozone. When the shadow of the great liner emerged again through the fog, it seemed almost alive in the shifting light. Its hull glistened with rainwater, the jagged tear in its side like an open wound. Miles stood for a long time at the base of the cliff, staring upward. Even in daylight, the ship seemed to resist comprehension. No human hands could have placed it there, balanced between earth and sea, as if it had been caught mid-fall by some unseen force. He climbed the same broken gangway as before, testing each step. It groaned but held. The air was cooler inside, still heavy with the smell of oil and mold. Water dripped through cracks above, pattering on metal floors. He retraced his path past the dining hall, now dim and ghostly in the morning light, and toward the lower decks where the secrets of the ship had begun to unfold. Down in the corridor, near the engine room, the silence was absolute. His flashlight beam caught droplets suspended in the air, tiny mirrors reflecting his face. The memory of the noise he had heard the night before, the soft clatter outside the medical room, returned vividly. Now there was nothing, only the steady rhythm of water falling somewhere far off. Bo stayed close, her breath visible in the cold. The door, marked medical storage, still hung open. Inside, the air was stale, the smell of disinfectant faint but distinct. Miles stepped carefully, examining what he hadn't noticed the night before. A clipboard lay on the floor beside one of the shelves, its pages warped but readable. Dates, times, and handwritten notes filled the columns, though many lines had been scratched out. He read aloud, softly to himself. Transfer completed. 12 subjects moved to lower hold, awaiting approval for disembarkation. The words chilled him. It was impossible to reconcile the image of a luxury cruise ship with the language of containment and transfer. He picked up another file from the desk, marked Incident Report. The first line was clear despite the smudged ink. Medical officer requests immediate communication with command regarding exposure risk. The rest of the text had bled into unreadable streaks. Miles set the papers down and scanned the room again. He noticed something new, a smear on the wall near the floor, faint but recognizable. He knelt. It was a handprint, dried long ago, the brownish stain blending into the rust. It was small, like that of a woman or a young man. He stared at it for a moment, then stood quickly, his pulse quickening. The room beyond the medical bay led into a corridor he hadn't explored yet. The sign above the archway was barely legible, but seemed to read, "Cargo Access." The metal floor was warped here, bent upward in some places as though from pressure beneath. He ducked under a low beam and followed the narrow path, his light cutting through the gloom. A few meters in, the air changed. It smelled less of oil now and more of something organic. Old wood, rotting cloth, and faintly the unmistakable scent of burned fuel. He found the source soon enough. At the corridor's end, a wide chamber opened up, its ceiling lost in shadow. The remnants of crates were scattered across the floor, many smashed open, their contents spilled out. Most of it was medical equipment, though some boxes held canned food and bottled water. The labels had foreign markings, different languages, Portuguese, Arabic, French. This had not been an ordinary cargo. It was a patchwork of supplies gathered from everywhere, as if the ship had been prepared for something long and secretive. Bo sniffed at one of the overturned crates and barked once. Inside lay a bundle of worn notebooks bound with string. Miles crouched and untied them. The pages inside were damp but legible, filled with handwriting, journal entries, perhaps from a crew member. The first few pages described routine work. Storm on horizon. Medical staff requested restricted access to B-deck. Captain uneasy, but following orders. Another entry read, "Rumors spreading. Passengers demanding answers. Security told us to stay quiet." The final pages were more erratic, the writing slanted, uneven. "We're locked out of the bridge. They say we're contaminated, but it's not sickness, it's fear. The lower deck doors sealed tonight. I think they're leaving us here." Miles felt the weight of the notebook in his hand like a stone. Every word deepened the pit in his stomach. This wasn't a tragedy of weather or chance. It was containment, an intentional abandonment. He looked around again at the smashed crates, the claw marks on the walls, the way the room seemed to bear witness to panic. People had fought here, desperate to get out. He moved to the far wall, where a small doorway led deeper into the ship. It was half blocked by a fallen cabinet, but he managed to squeeze through. The corridor beyond was narrower and darker, lined with emergency lights that no longer glowed. Here, the silence was so complete it hurt. His own breathing sounded too loud, too human. He passed more rooms, crew quarters, storage lockers, each filled with remnants of life abruptly interrupted. In one bunk room he found a photograph pinned to a wall, a group of men in uniforms, smiling. The words "Aurora Line, Training Crew 2015" were printed beneath. Their faces looked ordinary, unaware of the fate awaiting them. He wondered how many of them had survived those final hours, and how many still rested somewhere inside the ship's steel belly. The air grew warmer as he descended another level. A faint hum echoed through the floor, not from machinery, but from the sea pressing against the hull. The structure groaned occasionally, a deep, resonant sound that reminded him the ship was still precariously balanced on the edge of the cliff. Every vibration made the metal beneath him tremble slightly. Bo began to grow restless, pacing ahead, nose to the ground. Then she stopped abruptly, tail stiff, and let out a low growl. Miles froze. Ahead, the corridor curved sharply to the left, ending in a heavy door. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it something gleamed faintly in the light. An overturned metal container. He approached slowly. The floor was slick with oil, and the air smelled of iron and something else he couldn't quite place, something acrid and chemical. He crouched beside the container and turned it upright. Inside were plastic pouches, emergency rations, water packs, and folded medical gowns, all of it untouched. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, taken only what they could carry. He noticed a smaller object lodged beneath the container. Pulling it free, he found a handheld radio, its casing cracked but the battery compartment intact. He pressed the power button. Nothing. Dead. Still, the presence of it meant someone had tried to communicate, maybe even after the ship was declared missing. He slipped it into his pack. The sound of the storm outside grew louder, a low, distant roar. The walls vibrated with the rhythm of waves striking the cliff below. He felt the faint shifting of the ship again, imperceptible but real. It was alive in its death, breathing through the pressure of the sea. He knew he should leave soon, but something kept pulling him deeper, a sense that the truth was close, just beyond reach. He retraced his steps back toward the engine room. The path was darker now. The clouds had thickened, cutting off what little daylight filtered through the upper decks. As he reached the junction near the stairwell, Bo stopped suddenly and whined, backing away. Miles turned the flashlight in the direction she faced and froze. On the wall, half obscured by grime, someone had written a single word in large, uneven letters: alive. The paint, or perhaps blood, had long dried, but the message was unmistakable. His breath caught. He touched the letters lightly, feeling the roughness of the dried residue. Whoever had written it had wanted someone, anyone, to know they had survived, at least for a time. The meaning was immediate, human, and terrible. He stood in silence for a long time. Rain pounded somewhere above, dripping through cracks like tears. He looked at Bo, who stared back at him, her eyes bright in the beam of the light. "We're leaving," he whispered. His voice barely carried over the groan of the hull. He turned toward the stairwell and began to climb, every step echoing through the ship's hollow ribs. On the bridge again, the storm had darkened the sky to near night. Lightning flashed distantly across the horizon. The ship's shadow loomed enormous against the cliffs, its form outlined briefly in white before the darkness returned. Miles crossed the deck quickly, the wind pulling at his coat. He paused once more at the edge of the gangway, looking back through the shattered windows. Inside, the darkness shifted, a trick of light and motion that could have been anything or nothing at all. When he finally stepped onto solid ground again, the rain began to fall harder. The path down the cliff was slick, but he moved quickly, the image of that single word burning behind his eyes. Alive. Not ghosts, not myths, people. There had been people trapped in that ship long after the world believed it lost. He didn't know how long they had survived or what had happened to them, but he knew the evidence of their struggle was still inside, waiting. By the time he reached the bottom, the ocean had turned black beneath. The great ship above seemed to merge with the sky, its shape vanishing into the mist. Bo pressed against his leg, trembling. Miles placed a hand on her head, his own thoughts racing. Whatever had happened on that ship was deliberate. It wasn't the chaos of nature, but the cold order of men trying to bury something too dangerous to be seen. As he turned toward home, lightning split the sky behind him. For an instant, the cliffs and the suspended hull of the Aurora line were illuminated in stark, spectral clarity. The rain turned to mist again, the world dissolving into gray. Miles didn't look back after that. But even as he walked through the wet grass and the roar of the sea faded behind him, he could still hear the faint echo of the ship's groan, like a living thing breathing through rusted lungs. Beneath it, in the hollow of his memory, a voice whispered through the steel corridors, faint, human, and impossible to silence. Miles awoke before dawn, though he could not say he had truly slept. The storm had passed, but its echo remained in his head, a deep, unbroken rumble like the breath of the sea itself. He sat by the dying embers of his fire, staring through the window at the first faint streaks of gray light. Outside, the ocean mist clung to the cliffs soft and heavy, veiling the monstrous shape that waited there. The image of that single word painted on the wall, alive, had followed him through the night, surfacing each time he closed his eyes. He had dreamed of footsteps echoing through the steel corridors, of voices whispering just out of reach, of the ship shifting slowly in its sleep. When the first gulls began to cry, he rose, dressed in silence, and packed his things. Bo sat near the door, watching him with expectant eyes. She seemed to know before he spoke that they would return to the wreck. There was no question in his mind anymore. Whatever had happened on that ship had not been a simple tragedy of the sea. It had been planned, executed, and then buried. And somewhere inside that vast corpse of steel lay proof, something that could explain why 300 lives had been erased from the world without a trace. The climb felt steeper that morning. The air was still, thick with the smell of brine and wet earth. The tide was lower now, revealing the black rock beneath the cliffs. Miles moved slowly, following the same path up the slope, the great hull of the Aurora line gradually emerging from the mist as he neared the top. The ship loomed like a monument to human arrogance, suspended above the sea, half-eaten by time but defiant still. He reached the torn side of the hull and paused to listen. The silence was unnatural, almost alive. Not even the wind dared to pass through the broken windows. He climbed aboard, stepping carefully over fallen debris. The metal was slick under his boots, the sound of his movements magnified in the still air. Bo followed close behind, sniffing each corner before advancing. Inside, the corridors felt colder. The familiar smell of oil and salt lingered, but beneath it there was something new, a faint trace of smoke. He switched on his flashlight and began his descent, retracing his path to the lower decks. As he passed the dining hall, he noticed for the first time that the tables had shifted. A few chairs that had been upright yesterday were now toppled, though he could not recall touching them. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing against his lungs. He found the stairwell that led to the engine room and began the long descent. The deeper he went, the louder the sound of dripping water became. It echoed through the steel like the ticking of some invisible clock. He tried to shake off the unease, focusing instead on the task ahead. Somewhere in the bowels of the ship was a functioning server. He had seen the blinking light when he'd first explored the engine room. If the system still held data, it might contain logs, videos, messages. He needed to see them. When he reached the lower deck, the air was dense and warm. The smell of fuel grew stronger. The emergency lights on the wall were dead, but their glass still gleamed faintly in his beam. He turned left toward the generator bay. The door was ajar now, though he had left it closed the day before. He stopped at the threshold, hand tightening around his flashlight. The inside was dark, but the faint glimmer of something metallic caught his eye. He stepped closer. The generator sat silent, coated in grime, but beside it lay a small portable power cell. It was modern, compact, and far too clean to have been here for 3 years. Miles knelt and examined it. The logo was still visible, a brand he recognized, used on research vessels and private security craft. Someone had been here recently, within the past few weeks. Perhaps within. He connected the power cell to the nearby control panel. A low hum vibrated through the floor as the circuits awoke. Lights flickered across the console, faint and uncertain, then steadied. On one of the auxiliary monitors, green text began to scroll. The system was alive, if barely. He reached for the nearest keyboard and brushed away a layer of dust. The keys resisted, stiff from corrosion. Slowly, he typed the commands he remembered from his days at sea. Basic diagnostics, power routing, access to log files. The screen flickered again, and then a list appeared. Video log, bridge cam, security log, deck 3, medical report archive. He stared at the words, his pulse hammering. The files were dated 3 years ago, the final days before the ship's disappearance. He clicked the first entry. The screen turned black, then grainy static filled it, resolving gradually into the image of the ship's bridge. The video shook as if filmed during a storm. Men and women in uniforms moved frantically, their faces pale in the dim emergency light. The camera caught the captain gripping the rail, shouting orders that the audio barely captured. Behind him, lightning flashed through the windows, turning everything stark and colorless. "Course deviation approved," a voice said, distorted but clear enough to understand. "Command has cut the feed. We're on our own." Miles watched, frozen. The captain turned toward someone off camera, his mouth moving rapidly. The sound cracked, then faded entirely, leaving only the groan of the storm. A second later, the lights flickered out. The recording ended in darkness. He played the next file. This one showed the medical bay, rows of beds, men and women lying motionless beneath white sheets. The camera angle shifted, revealing 2 figures in protective gear moving among them. One held a clipboard, the other a small case marked with the Helios Foundation logo. Their voices were faint, but he could make out fragments. "Containment compromised, not infection, exposure. Orders to seal Deck 5. The sound wavered again, then died as the screen filled with static. He leaned back, breathing hard. Each video was a fragment, a glimpse into chaos. They told no full story, only pieces of one too large to see. He loaded the third file, security log, Deck 3. The timestamp showed the final day before the ship's last transmission. The image revealed a group of passengers gathered near a locked bulkhead. Some shouted, others pounded the door. A crewman tried to calm them, but his words were lost in the noise. Then, abruptly, the screen went white. Miles sat there in the flickering glow, the sound of the ship's slow creak surrounding him. The truth was beginning to take shape. The Aurora line had been more than a cruise. It had been a floating experiment, a vessel turned prison. And when something went wrong, the people in charge had chosen to bury the evidence at sea. He copied the data to a portable drive he'd brought in his pack. The process was slow, the progress bar crawling across the screen. Bo lay beside him, ears pricked, restless. The hum of the generator filled the silence. He checked the battery level, 40% left, enough to finish the transfer. A soft noise broke the rhythm, a metallic thud from somewhere above. He froze, listening. Another sound followed, closer this time. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy. He reached for the flashlight, turned it off, and waited in darkness. The generator hummed quietly, its small lights glowing like fireflies in the black. The footsteps moved down the corridor, then stopped outside the door. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint scrape of metal. Someone testing the latch. Miles held his breath, his fingers tightening around the handle of his knife. Bo growled low in her throat. The latch clicked once, twice, then the sound moved away, fading slowly into the distance. He waited another full minute before exhaling. Whoever it was, they knew he was here now. He turned the flashlight back on, its beam trembling slightly in his hand. The data transfer was complete. He ejected the drive and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The monitor still glowed faintly, the final file open on the screen. He hesitated, then clicked one last entry. Bridge log, time-stamped only minutes after the previous one had ended. The image appeared almost instantly. The camera was tilted, the angle wrong. The bridge was half dark, lit only by the strobing light of alarms. The captain was gone. The officer from before stood alone near the window, his face pale and wet with sweat. He spoke directly into the recorder. "If anyone finds this, the passengers didn't die of sickness. We were told to keep them below. They knew what they were carrying. We tried to turn back, but they locked the controls from the mainland." Miles felt the blood drain from his face. The officer leaned closer to the lens, his eyes wide, desperate. "They'll say it was an accident. They'll say we sank. But we're still here. God help us." The screen went black. He stood there in the glow of the dead monitor, the words echoing in his head. Not lost, abandoned. Every instinct in him screamed to leave, to get out before whoever was walking these halls returned. He turned off the generator, plunging the room into silence, and slung his pack over his shoulder. As he stepped into the corridor, the air seemed heavier. The faint smell of smoke was stronger now. The ship moaned again, a deep vibration that ran through his bones. Somewhere above, metal clanged, and he realized with sudden dread that part of the deck had shifted. The structure was unstable. One good storm and the entire carcass could tumble into the sea. He moved quickly through the passageways, his flashlight beam darting across the walls. The letters "Alive" glistened faintly where the light caught them, as though written anew. When he reached the upper stairwell, the air from outside hit him, cool, sharp, and wet with rain. He climbed fast, Bo following close, and emerged onto the deck just as lightning split the sky. The thunder came a heartbeat later, rolling across the cliffs like a cannon. The world had turned silver gray again, the ocean below restless and dark. The ship groaned beneath him, a sound that seemed almost human. He paused, catching his breath, and looked back once more toward the broken bridge. The words of the officer replayed in his mind. "We're not lost. We've been abandoned." Miles stepped onto the gangway and began the descent, the rain stinging his face. He clutched the pocket where the drive rested, feeling its hard edges through the fabric. It was proof, cold, undeniable proof, that the Aurora line had not been lost to the sea, but buried by design. As he reached the base of the cliff, he glanced upward one last time. The lightning flashed again, and for an instant the ship's silhouette seemed to lean closer, its prow hanging over the void like a blade. The next second, it vanished into darkness. The wind howled, carrying the sound of grinding metal, a reminder that the line between land and sea was thin, and that nothing stayed hidden forever. He turned away, heading toward the faint light of his cabin in the distance. Behind him, the rain blurred the outline of the cliffs, and the great ship faded once more into mist. But the truth he carried in his pocket burned hotter than the storm itself, and though he didn't yet know it, that truth would soon draw others to the cliffs, those who had lost their secrets to the sea, and those determined to keep them buried there. The following days passed in uneasy silence. Miles scarcely left his cabin, his thoughts consumed by the files he had copied from the ship's dying server. He played them over and over again on his old laptop, watching the grainy images flicker and fade, listening to voices that had spoken their last words 3 years ago. The confession of the officer on the bridge repeated in his mind until it lost all sense of being mere sound and became something heavier, an accusation that would not leave him in peace. At night, he would sit outside beneath the dim lantern light, staring towards the cliffs where the mist always hung thickest. He could see nothing of the ship from his vantage point, but he knew it was there, its bulk clinging to the rock like a parasite to flesh. The wind carried faint metallic groans across the valley, and sometimes he thought he could still hear the echo of footsteps deep within the hull. He tried to convince himself to leave, to travel south to the city and turn over the drive to the authorities or the press. But every time he imagined it, a quiet voice inside reminded him that no one would believe him without the physical proof of the wreck itself, and even then, powerful men had long arms. The Helios Foundation was not a name unknown to him. It appeared in whispers attached to research vessels, to rumors of private experiments in international waters. He knew that if the story reached the wrong ears, it would vanish as surely as the Aurora line had. So he waited, watched, and thought. Bo, usually restless, had grown subdued. She lay near the door most of the time, her head on her paws, her eyes fixed on the dark stretch of coastline. Miles noticed that she flinched at sounds that once would not have bothered her. The whistle of the wind, the slam of a shutter, the crack of driftwood in the fire. He rose from bed instantly, hand reaching for the rifle by the wall. Outside, through the narrow window, he saw lights moving along the upper ridge, white beams cutting through the fog, sweeping methodically back and forth. He counted 3, maybe 4. They moved slowly, deliberately, not like tourists or fishermen, but like men searching for something. He doused the lantern and crouched near the floor, watching. The beams moved closer to the cliff, then paused. A faint hum reached his ears, the distinct mechanical whine of a drone. He felt the muscles in his shoulders tighten. Whoever they were equipped and trained. They would have known already that someone had been aboard the wreck. Perhaps they had detected the power surge when he activated the generator, or maybe the Helios Foundation had monitored the area ever since the disappearance. Either way, they were here now. The lights remained for nearly half an hour, drifting back and forth, scanning the landscape. Then, as quietly as they had appeared, they faded into the mist. Miles stayed awake until dawn, rifle across his knees, the dog curled at his feet. When the first pale light of morning spread across the horizon, the cliffs looked calm again, innocent even, but he no longer trusted appearances. By midday, he had made his decision. The files were not safe here. The old laptop was unreliable, and if those men came again, they would find and destroy everything. He would take the drive to the harbor town 30 miles south, where a friend of his, an old journalist named Corbett, might still work at the local paper. Corbett had been one of the few who had reported on the Aurora line when it vanished, suggesting government cover-ups and corporate interference. The story had been buried, and Corbett had been quietly dismissed a few months later. If anyone would understand what this discovery meant, it would be him. Miles packed at first light the next day. The rain had stopped, leaving the world heavy and quiet. The path to the cliffs was slick but manageable. He carried only what he needed: the rifle, some food, and the waterproof pouch containing the drive. Bo trotted ahead, occasionally looking back as if to make sure he was still following. When they reached the upper ridge, the sea spread before them like molten lead, the mist rolling low across its surface. The ship was hidden now, swallowed by fog. It almost seemed to watch him leave. The first part of the journey went quickly. The dirt track wound through the low hills covered in wild grass and the remnants of old stone walls. Miles kept to the higher ground, avoiding the road that led to the village, wary of who might be traveling it. Around midday, he stopped at a stream to rest. The water was cold and clear, and as he filled his canteen, Bo lifted her head suddenly, ears sharp. Miles followed her gaze. On the opposite ridge, a thin column of dust rose against the pale sky. Vehicle tracks. He crouched low, peering through the brush. 2 black SUVs moved along the narrow dirt road, the kind rarely used except by military or survey teams. Even from a distance, their uniform shape and slow, measured pace betrayed their purpose. He waited until they passed out of sight before moving again, cutting east toward the forest. By the time he reached the tree line, clouds had begun to gather. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the promise of another storm. The forest offered cover, but it also brought silence, the kind that amplifies every sound. The crack of a branch under his boot felt deafening. He pressed on until the shadows deepened, following an old hunter's trail he knew well. His mind replayed the officer's last words, the panic in his voice, and the quiet certainty that the ship had been doomed by human hands. He felt the same weight now pressing on him, a knowledge too dangerous to carry alone. When dusk came, he built no fire. He and Bo rested under a fallen tree, sharing what little food he had brought. The forest was alive with the faint rustle of nocturnal creatures, but beneath it he heard something else. A distant drone, faint but steady, like an insect that never tired. He scanned the sky through the gaps in the branches and saw a speck of light moving against the dark. It hovered for a few seconds, then drifted away toward the coast. They were still searching. Sleep came in fragments, light and haunted. At one point, he thought he heard voices in the distance carried by the wind. By morning, the forest was silent again. He continued south, skirting the old railway line until he saw the first rooftops of the harbor town glinting through the haze. Relief touched him briefly, but it didn't last. He entered through the northern road, passing shuttered shops and empty docks. Only a few fishermen lingered near the pier, repairing nets in silence. When they saw him, some nodded in recognition, but their expressions were guarded. He made his way toward the outskirts where Corbett's small house overlooked the bay. The front door was ajar. Bo growled softly as they approached. Miles pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint metallic tang of dried blood. The table in the main room had been overturned, papers scattered across the floor. A single coffee cup lay shattered near the sink. He stepped cautiously inside. The television was on, showing only static. On the wall, a faint handprint smeared the paint the same brownish color he had seen on the ship. He found Corbett in the back room lying near the desk. His body was twisted unnaturally, one arm reaching toward the phone. Miles knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse he knew wouldn't be there. The old man's eyes were half open, his face strangely peaceful. A single bullet hole marred his chest. There had been no struggle, only precision. Whoever had done this wanted no mess, no noise. He had been silenced cleanly. Miles felt something tighten in his chest. He stood and scanned the room. The shelves were empty, the drawers pulled out. Whatever notes or files Corbett had kept were gone. On the desk lay a single sheet of paper, weighted down by a pen. It bore only 3 words: "They're watching everything." He backed away slowly, every sense alert. Outside, the street was still deserted, but he no longer trusted the quiet. He took the back door into the alley and moved toward the cliffs that overlooked the sea. From there, he could see the road leading out of town and the black SUVs parked near the main square. Men in dark jackets stood beside them, speaking into radios. Even from this distance, Miles could see the glint of weapons at their sides. He ducked behind the rocks, heart pounding. They had moved faster than he expected. The discovery of the power activation on the ship must have alerted them. The Helios Foundation, or whatever private arm it used for such operations, had come to erase the trail. Corbett's death was proof enough of that. The sound of tires on gravel snapped him back to the present. Another vehicle was approaching from the east, heading directly toward the overlook. He had seconds to decide. He reached into his coat, feeling the drive against his chest. He could not run toward town, and the cliffs behind offered no cover. The only chance was the old drainage tunnel below the lighthouse, a narrow passage that led down to the beach. He had used it once years ago during a storm. If it hadn't collapsed, it might still offer escape. He whistled softly to Bo, and they moved quickly through the tall grass, keeping low. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath a slab of broken concrete. He pried it open with the rifle barrel and slipped inside. The air was damp and foul, but the passage was still intact. He crawled for what felt like an eternity, the light behind him shrinking to a pinprick, until at last he emerged onto the narrow strip of beach below the cliffs. The sea stretched endless and gray before him. He crouched behind a boulder, breathing hard. Above, voices echoed faintly, carried by the wind. Men shouting orders, the bark of radios. Then came the sharp buzz of a drone sweeping overhead. He pressed himself against the rock, motionless, as the machine hovered for a moment before drifting away. When the sound finally faded, he looked down at Bo, who was watching him with wide, steady eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the drive. The metal felt cold, almost alive, as if it carried the heartbeat of everyone who had died on that ship. Corbett was gone, and now there was no one left he could trust. The truth was too heavy for one man to bear, but he had no choice. The files had to survive. He scanned the horizon. The tide was rising fast, the waves gnawing at the rocks. Far out to sea, a fishing boat drifted lazily, its nets trailing. Perhaps he could reach it, barter passage to another harbor, another country. But even as he thought it, he knew running would not end this. The Helios Foundation would keep searching until they found what he had taken. And if they couldn't find him, they would destroy the evidence itself, the wreck, the cliffs, everything. The sun dipped low, turning the water the color of molten steel. Miles watched the horizon until his resolve hardened. He would go back one last time. The ship still held its own truth. That night, he and Bo made their way along the beach, moving north towards the cliffs where the Aurora line slept. The wind carried the distant rumble of engines from the town, and somewhere behind them, headlights flickered like distant lightning. The storm that had taken the ship had long since passed, but another was gathering, one born not from nature, but from men desperate to bury their sins. By the time they reached the foot of the cliffs, darkness had fallen completely. The ocean hissed against the rocks, and high above, the ship loomed faintly in the moonlight, silent and waiting. Miles tightened his pack straps, feeling the drive secure against his chest. The time for hiding was over. The only way to protect the truth was to make it visible, undeniable. And if that meant facing those who hunted him, then so be it. He looked once more toward the black horizon, then began the climb. The wind howled through the ravine, carrying the sound of grinding metal, as if the ship itself sensed what was coming. The climb back to the wreck was harder than Miles remembered. His muscles ached from sleepless nights and tension that no amount of rest could undo. The sea wind howled through the cracks in the cliffs, carrying the sharp scent of salt and rain. Clouds moved low and heavy across the sky, a warning of another storm on the horizon. Bo followed close behind, her paws slick with mud, her breathing steady. She never once strayed far, as if she understood that this journey was not merely a return, but a reckoning. By the time they reached the top, dusk had already begun to gather. The colossal shape of the Aurora line emerged slowly through the fog, the same way it had that first morning, its bow suspended over the abyss like the edge of a nightmare. Miles stood still, staring up at it. The ship was no longer just a relic to him. It was a witness, mute and unyielding, carrying within its rusted hull the testimony of all who had been lost. Somewhere inside those silent decks were answers, waiting to be unearthed before the men hunting him buried them forever. He climbed through the torn opening in the hull, feeling the sharp edges of corroded metal scrape against his coat. The interior was darker now, the corridors filled with a chill that seemed deeper than air could hold. Every step echoed, carried down through the steel passageways. The place felt aware of his return. The faint hum of the sea beneath the ship blended with the groans of strained metal, creating a rhythm that reminded him of breathing. The Aurora line was alive in its own way, slow, patient, and filled with memory. He made his way toward the lower decks, guided by the narrow beam of his flashlight. The path was familiar now. The ruined dining hall, the narrow stairwell, the dark corridor leading toward the engine bay. As he moved deeper, he noticed signs that hadn't been there before. Footprints in the thin layer of dust, scuff marks on the walls, a faint trail of water leading from the direction of the medical section. He crouched to touch one of the prints. It was fresh. Someone else had been here since the last visit, perhaps within hours. Bo whined softly, her nose twitching. Miles whispered for silence and pressed forward. The air thickened as he approached the medical bay, heavy with the metallic tang of chemicals. When he reached the doorway, he saw that it had been forced open further. The lock mechanism hung broken, torn by something strong. Inside, the shelves that had once been intact were overturned, their contents strewn across the floor. The canisters he'd seen before, those labeled with red hazard symbols, were gone. Only fragments of shattered glass and twisted metal remained. Whoever had come here had not only taken what was left, they had tried to erase it. He knelt beside the overturned desk and found scraps of paper scattered like fallen leaves. Some were still legible. One fragment bore a signature he recognized from the reports, Dr. L. Varenne, the same name that had appeared in the experiment logs. He picked up another sheet. Half a sentence was still visible. Subject transfer delayed, containment compromised, prepare extraction via Healy. The rest had been torn away. The truth was close enough now to feel. Whatever Helios had done aboard this ship, they had tried to remove every trace of it. And if they had returned now, they were likely preparing to finish what they'd started, by destroying the wreck itself. The thought pushed him onward. He moved deeper into the deck toward the engine chamber. The narrow corridors pulsed with the sound of the sea below. Water dripped. When he entered the generator bay, the smell of oil was overwhelming. The power cell he had used before was gone. In its place lay a coil of fresh cables recently unrolled. He crouched to inspect them. Industrial-grade detonator wire. His stomach turned cold. They were preparing to demolish the ship. He stood, listening. From somewhere far above, faint metallic thuds echoed, boots striking steel. Voices followed, muffled but unmistakable. At least 3, maybe 4 men. They were moving through the upper deck, their footsteps deliberate and synchronized. He glanced around the room, searching for cover, and ducked behind a large piece of machinery near the rear wall. Bo pressed close beside him, trembling but silent. The voices drew closer. He could make out fragments of conversation in the still air. One spoke in clipped tones, authoritative. "We'll start with the engine bay. Once the charges are set, move to the bridge. Full collapse into the sea before sunrise." Another voice, younger, replied, "What about the man? The drone picked up movement last night." A pause. "Doesn't matter. If he's still here, he'll go down with it." Miles felt his pulse quicken. He reached slowly into his pack and pulled out the small camera, checking the battery. Still alive. If he could record what they were doing, capture their voices, their faces, it might be enough to prove who was behind this. He turned on the device, set it to record, and held it low near the floor. The faint red light blinked like a heartbeat. The men entered the engine room moments later, 3 of them just as he'd guessed. They wore dark tactical gear, no insignias, their faces obscured by masks. One carried a heavy case marked with the Helios emblem. They moved efficiently, placing small metallic canisters along the walls and machinery, charges wired together by the same yellow cable he had seen. The leader consulted a handheld tablet, tapping at the screen. 2 minutes per placement, he said. We'll detonate remotely once we're clear. Miles stayed absolutely still, his breathing shallow. Bo did not move. The men worked in silence, the only sound the soft click of metal against metal. When they finished, they turned toward the exit. The leader paused briefly, scanning the room. For a moment, his gaze lingered near the shadows where Miles hid. Then he spoke into his radio. "Engine deck clear. Proceed to bridge." When their footsteps faded, Miles exhaled slowly. The camera light blinked steadily in the dark. He knew he couldn't stop them all, but he could disrupt their plan. He moved quickly once they were gone, tracing the detonator wires along the wall. They converged at a single junction box near the stairwell, a control hub for the entire system. He examined it by flashlight, noting the timer readout already counting down. They had set the charge to detonate in less than an hour. He had 2 choices: disarm it or escape. But disarming it meant time, and time was the one thing he didn't have. He stared at the timer, watching the numbers tick down. 48 minutes. He could still reach the bridge, maybe find another exit before the explosion, yet every instinct told him to stay. To try, at least, to save what he could of the ship's testimony. If the Aurora line sank into the sea, so would the truth. He pulled a small toolkit from his pack. His hands shook as he pried open the junction box. Inside, wires of red, blue, and white intertwined like veins. He studied them carefully. Whoever had wired this was meticulous, professional. One wrong cut could trigger the detonation early. He wiped the sweat from his brow and worked by memory, following the color sequence he'd learned years ago as a sailor handling emergency power circuits. The seconds crawled by. Bo whined softly, pacing near his side. Then, just as he was about to make the final cut, the ship shuddered violently. A deep groan reverberated through the metal structure. He froze. The sound came again, a crash of something massive collapsing above. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The detonations hadn't gone off yet. The collapse was natural. The cliff beneath the ship was giving way under its weight. He realized with horror that even if he stopped the charges, gravity itself might finish what Helios had begun. He forced himself to focus, cutting the last wire cleanly. The timer flickered, then froze at 31 minutes. The hum of the system died. He sat back, breathing hard. For a moment, all was still except for the distant roar of waves. Then came another sound, shouts from above. The men had realized the system was offline. Their footsteps thundered through the corridors. Miles grabbed the camera and stuffed it into his pack. He ran toward the stairwell, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the walls. The ship lurched again, tilting slightly toward the sea. Water poured in through cracks along the lower deck, pooling at his feet. The sound of pursuit echoed closer, boots pounding, voices shouting orders. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the metal vibrating beneath him. Every few seconds, another crash shook the hull. When he reached the bridge deck, the air was thick with fog and dust. The windows were shattered, the view outside obscured by rain. He crossed to the control panel, still littered with debris from years past. On the wall, one of the old security monitors flickered faintly to life. The system, half dead, but still responsive. On its screen, he saw a single camera feed from the exterior hull, showing the cliffs below. The base of the ship was beginning to break apart, pieces tumbling into the waves. He turned as the door burst open. 2 of the men stormed in, weapons raised. He dove behind the console, a bullet ricocheting off the steel frame beside his head. Bo barked furiously, darting toward them. One of the men shouted and kicked at the dog, but she was too quick, snapping at his arm. Miles seized the moment, grabbing a fallen metal rod and hurling it at the second man. It struck his shoulder, sending him sprawling. The first raised his weapon again, but Bo lunged, biting down hard. The gun discharged, the bullet shattering the glass behind them. Miles moved fast, tackling the man to the ground. The fight was brief and brutal. When it was over, both men were down, one unconscious, the other gasping for breath. Miles stood, chest heaving, blood running from a cut on his forehead. Bo limped slightly, but her eyes were fierce, unbroken. The third man, the leader, was nowhere in sight. He turned back to the monitor. The feed showed something new now, an outline of a helicopter approaching through the mist, its lights cutting through the darkness. They were coming to finish the job. He had minutes, maybe less. He grabbed the nearest flare gun from the emergency rack, loaded it, and aimed it through the broken window. The red flame streaked into the sky, bursting like a wound against the gray clouds. Somewhere out at sea, a distant fishing vessel might see it. Someone had to. The roar of the helicopter grew louder. He could see its silhouette now, hovering above the cliff edge. Through the open door, a figure leaned out, gesturing frantically to the men below. The downwash from the rotors whipped the rain into a storm of its own. Miles braced himself against the console, the wind tearing at his coat. He knew he wouldn't make it down alive if they decided to fire. But if he could hold them long enough, if the flare had reached someone, maybe the truth would survive even if he didn't. The leader appeared at the doorway, his face half hidden behind the mask. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, one filled with exhaustion, the other with cold certainty. The man raised a small device in his hand, the detonator. He pressed the trigger. The explosion began deep below, a low roar that rose through the decks like the howl of a dying animal. The floor heaved beneath Miles's feet. He grabbed Bo, pulling her close as the world tilted violently. The bridge windows imploded, the wind screaming through the broken glass. The helicopter veered upward, vanishing into the storm as the Aurora line began to fall. Steel tore against stone, the sound like thunder as the ship finally surrendered to gravity. Miles clung to the rail, the camera still strapped inside his pack. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into chaos was the endless gray of the sea rising to meet him, and the faint reflection of his own face in the shattered glass, bearing witness to the truth that no one had wanted to see. When Miles came to, the world was nothing but water and light. His mind drifted in fragments, flashes of sound, the roar of collapsing metal, the sensation of falling through air that turned instantly to sea. He coughed hard, choking on salt, his chest convulsing as he fought for breath. Waves crashed against him, dragging him down, then flinging him upward again. Through the blur of spray and pain, he glimpsed pieces of the Aurora line tumbling through the surf, massive slabs of steel and debris scattering like bones. The air was filled with the deep, guttural thunder of a dying ship. He kicked toward the surface, the weight of his soaked clothes pulling him down. For a moment, he thought of letting go, of surrendering to the pull of the depths where silence waited. But then he felt movement beside him. That sight, simple, real, living, shook him back into himself. He reached for her, one arm flailing against the waves, and together they found the rhythm of survival. The ocean tossed them like toys, but Miles knew the shore was somewhere behind the wall of mist. He forced his body to move, stroke by stroke, each breath a battle. When his hands finally met rock, it felt unreal. He clawed his way upward, the surf dragging at his legs, and collapsed onto the wet stones, gasping. Bo scrambled beside him, shaking violently, spraying water everywhere before curling close, trembling but unhurt. For a long time, Miles lay motionless, listening to the sea's roar slowly fade into a dull, distant hum. The storm had begun to pass. Above them, the clouds split open, revealing a pale gray light that seemed almost merciful. He lifted his head. The cliffs were shrouded in mist, but the ship was gone. The place where it had hung over the edge was now a jagged scar of rock and twisted debris. Pieces of hull still jutted from the cliff face, dripping seawater like blood from a wound. Further out, the ocean boiled with wreckage. Sections of deck, lifeboats, twisted beams drifting among the waves. And amid it all, something gleamed faintly. A fragment of the ship's bridge, half submerged, its windows shattered. The Aurora line had fallen, but it had not disappeared entirely. He dragged himself higher onto the rocks and sat up, his whole body trembling. Every muscle screamed, and blood ran in thin streams from a dozen cuts. His clothes were torn, his hands raw, yet in his chest pocket, pressed close to his heart, he could feel the hard, reassuring shape of the camera. Against all odds, it had survived. He unzipped the pocket and pulled it out with shaking hands. The screen was cracked, but the red recording light still blinked faintly. Somehow it had captured everything: the men, the explosives, the final moments before the fall. Proof. He stared at the little device as if it were a living thing. Then he looked out across the sea again, where smoke still curled from the wreck. The helicopter was gone, vanished into the clouds. Perhaps they believed him dead. Perhaps they didn't care. Either way, they had left him alive, and that was a mistake they would come to regret. He stayed there for hours, waiting for the tide to recede, gathering his strength. Bo lay beside him, occasionally lifting her head to watch the waves. The wind carried the scent of diesel and ash. When the water finally began to draw back, it revealed the shattered skeleton of the ship spread across the shore below. Miles stood, unsteady, and began the slow climb down toward the wreckage. The descent was perilous, the rocks slick with seawater. He moved carefully, testing each step until he reached the first massive slab of steel. It was bent inward, blackened by explosion. Around it, the sand was littered with remnants of lives: a child's shoe, a torn piece of fabric, a cracked porcelain plate. The ocean had returned what men had tried to hide. He picked his way through the wreckage, searching for anything that might have survived. The lower decks had been obliterated, but near the stern he found the remnants of a cargo crate wedged between two slabs of metal. Inside were waterlogged papers, fragments of binders, and something else: an intact waterproof case sealed with a red latch. He pried it open. Inside lay a hard drive, the kind used in data recorders. It was labeled Helios Project Archive A7. For a moment, he could only stare. Then he laughed, the sound raw and hoarse. The sea had done what it always did. It had taken, but it had also returned. He slipped the drive into his pack beside the camera. Between the two, he now held everything the Foundation had tried to destroy. As the hours passed, the tide continued to pull back, revealing more of the ship's broken body. The sheer scale of it was staggering. Corridors torn open, engines split like bones. It looked less like a vessel now and more like the carcass of some immense creature, its insides laid bare for the world to see. Gulls circled above, crying harshly, their calls echoing off the cliffs. Miles found a section of the bridge still intact enough to enter. The metal groaned under his weight as he climbed inside. The air smelled of salt and oil. Papers clung to the walls, fused there by moisture. Among them was a torn photograph pinned beneath a piece of twisted metal. A group of passengers smiling on the deck, sunlight bright on their faces. At the edge of the photo, half hidden, was the ship's name: Aurora Lan Voyage 1. He slipped the photo into his pocket. Whatever had happened here was no longer just his burden. By nightfall, the wind had died. The sea stretched calm and dark, its surface scattered with the glitter of debris reflecting starlight. Miles built a small fire from driftwood on the shore. Bo lay beside him, her head resting on his knee. He stared into the flames, his mind a slow whirl of exhaustion and resolve. The Foundation would return, of that he was certain. They would come to erase the last trace of their failure, perhaps with more precision this time, but he would be ready. In the distance, faint lights glowed on the horizon. A fishing vessel, maybe two, drawn by the flare he had fired before the fall. If they saw the wreck, if they reached him before Helios did, the truth might yet escape this place. He took the camera in his hands again, shielding it from the firelight, and whispered quietly into the microphone. "My name is Miles Carter," he said, his voice low but steady. "This is what's left of the Aurora line. They said it was lost at sea, but that was a lie. It was destroyed by the Helios Foundation. They tried to erase it, and everyone on it. But the sea doesn't forget." He stopped, staring out at the water, the sound of the waves filling the silence. "If anyone finds this," he continued, "don't let them bury it again. Don't let them bury us." He turned off the camera and sat back, feeling the weight of everything settle inside him. The night was deep now, the stars hidden behind clouds. Bo shifted in her sleep, pressing against his leg. He reached down to stroke her fur, his hand trembling slightly. Somewhere behind them, far up the cliffs, a faint mechanical hum rose, a drone circling, its red light blinking like an eye in the dark. Miles didn't move. He watched it for a long time, then reached for the camera again. He turned it on, aiming the lens toward the drone's light. "You can watch all you want," he murmured, "but you can't stop what's already in motion." The drone hovered for a few moments more before disappearing into the clouds. By dawn, the fishing vessel had reached the shore. 2 men disembarked, their shouts echoing faintly through the morning fog. When they saw him, they hesitated, taking in the wreckage spread along the coast. Miles stood, lifting the camera and the waterproof case. "You need to see this," he said simply, "and the world needs to hear it." They led him aboard, helping Bo up after him. As the boat pulled away from the shore, Miles turned one last time toward the cliffs. The sea was already reclaiming the remains of the Aurora line, drawing its bones back into the depths. Only the jagged outline of the stern still showed above the waves, glinting faintly in the light. Then it, too, slipped beneath the surface. He watched until the last trace was gone. The ocean lay smooth again, silent as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Yet he knew the truth now. The sea did not erase. It remembered. It held every secret, every crime, every lie that men had tried to sink within it. And now, thanks to him, it would speak. As the boat turned toward the open horizon, Miles let the wind dry the salt from his face. Bo lay at his feet, her eyes half closed, finally at peace. Behind them, the coast grew smaller, the cliffs fading into mist. Ahead, the sun broke through the clouds, laying a path of light across the water. He reached into his jacket, feeling the hard drive and the camera pressed against his chest. The evidence was safe, for now, but he understood that the fight had only begun. The sea had returned its truth to him, and with that gift came a duty heavier than any storm. He looked once more toward the horizon, then whispered to himself, "They can bury ships, they can bury names, but they can't bury what the ocean remembers." The wind carried his words away, scattering them across the endless expanse of water where the Aurora line had fallen, and where its story would now rise again, reborn not as tragedy, but as testimony. Subscribe before you miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications. New stories like this one are coming soon, and each one is even more unbelievable. Don't stop here. Watch the next video and uncover more shocking true-style mysteries we've brought to life. And if this story gave you chills,